I mentioned last time that we would talk a little bit about Papillon. It's a film in the 1970s, Franklin Schaeffler, I believe, Steve McQueen has the role of Papillon. Papillon is a man who is apparently falsely accused, but he's imprisoned in a really problematic, punitive, oppressive system, and he tries to escape. And the film interestingly plays out this idea. He goes in, you could say, as Henri Charriere, but by the time he's in the prison, he starts to be called Papillon. And Papillon is the name that he's given. He's got this blue tattoo on his chest of a butterfly, obviously, which is this insignia of flight and escape. And of course, throughout his prison experience, we start to get a sense of this drive that really fundamentally underlies his agenda and who he is as a subject. He's the subject of the death drive. At least this would be my argument. So we could say a couple of things about that. But first, let's just make a note on the film and the form of the film. The film, for me, is really instructive because I think most of us have grown up on the kind of enduring spirit of the person who never gives up, the kind of Nelson Mandela story, or to take it back to Hollywood, a kind of Shawshank Redemption, which is precisely redemptive. And what we see in Papillon is not a redemption story. In fact, it's almost frightening in what we see. But if we're going to get a sense of how Papillon embodies the death drive, let's pick out a couple of scenes from the film. So right at the beginning of the film, we see a whole bunch of prisoners. They're all being marched down to the docks from some part of Paris. They're going to be taken from this port and taken to this island in French Guiana. And as they're walking along, a woman shouts out, "Papillon, Papillon!" And he waves, and she goes, "You'll be back, you'll be back." And then a prisoner walks up alongside Papillon, and he goes, "No, you won't," in this kind of somber tone. And in a sense, that's right. That Charriere is not coming back, actually. This subject who has a name, a place, a location, who has a kind of civic identity, who is a citizen of France, that person is being lost. Because as they get into the boat, they go onto the ship and are transported to this place that's inaccessible and today historically kind of almost not forgotten, but neglected and dilapidated. It's almost that this is the passage of the subject from being a subject within the symbolic to being a subject who's cut off from the symbolic, who's consigned to a type of non-history, who is, to use the Fanon term, someone who's a wretched of the earth, an example of that. Which incidentally, while we're on the topic, we could say that a text like Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad does a really interesting job of illustrating something of the social death of slavery within American history of slavery. And of course, there's an awful lot of literature that now wants to argue that this is the paradigm, slavery as instantiating a kind of social death in the terms of Afro-pessimism, or in terms of this theory, as instantiating a kind of symbolic death, where to be a slave meant that not only you didn't have rights, but you didn't even have a name or a family name. Being a little bit cautious here because I don't know enough about this history, but that you existed within a place where you weren't allowed the status of the human subject. You were excluded from the parameters of the human in the social death or the symbolic death of slavery. Now, we could argue that my extrapolation to Henri Charriere and Papillon in this respect may sound a little bit problematic because he's not the subject of racism, but I think we can still do something with this because I think he does enact or his trajectory enacts a kind of symbolic death. But back to the film, that's one key scene. A second key scene happens when there's an escape attempt. Now bear in mind, there's this genius moment here where you cast Steve McQueen, you know, the guy who was in The Great Escape and all these like heroic action man Hollywood movies, as Papillon. So for a kind of uneducated film viewer like me, or someone who has seen Steve McQueen in other films, you're expecting him to be able to do this heroic thing. But there's escape attempt after escape attempt where he's subjected to like horrendous violence. And we have this scene where he's caught. I believe he gets sold out by a nun. Remember that? Whatever. Anyways, he gets sold out by some nuns and he gets taken back to the prison. He gets thrown into this kind of cell pit under the ground, and there's a dramatic scene that covers over the top, so there's no light. And the vital, handsome Steve McQueen figure that we see at the beginning is subjected to some horrendous period, 3 or 4 years of existence in apparent solitary confinement without any light. So then comes the second scene, which is so memorable, or certainly was memorable to me as a boy watching the film, is he comes out and he's like all hunched and crooked, he's lost some teeth, and he's pale as anything, and he's aged. And for the Hollywood kind of audience, you're like, well, hold on, we thought he was, going to escape and like still be handsome. But here he's this like crotchety old guy who seems to be almost fundamentally emaciated. And it's in this moment, I suppose, that one has the thought, maybe if you've read too much Lacan, is that he sometimes seems to have persisted beyond his own death. Now, physically, he's still alive, so that's not strictly true, although it has a nice metaphoric resonance, that he somehow persisted beyond the natural term of his life, or the natural term that many people would be able to manage. But of course, he continues. And here we get a nice sense of being between the two deaths. He has now ceased to exist as Henri Charriere. Maybe Papillon continues to exist, but he persists beyond where he has a meaningful symbolic identity as a citizen of France. He's persisted beyond that. He's also seemingly persisted beyond a series of possibilities for actual death, but he lives on, he continues. We could ask, if we were going to do some kind of psychological speculation, psychoanalytic speculation, what is it that keeps him going? Why does he even remain alive? Nevertheless, he is set free, and we see a kind of nice illustrative instantiation of the fact that he's undergone the symbolic death, where he's sitting next to some other prisoner, and the prisoner thinks that there's a problem here. He's an aggressive prisoner. He says, "Who are you looking at? Who do you think you are?" And Papillon goes, "No one. I'm no one." This kind of indication to the audience, at least, that there's some change that's happened, some kind of loss of a previous symbolic identity. So the third moment in the film is now that Charriere is so much older, he's deemed a non-escape risk, and there's one part in the French Guiana penal colony, which is exactly Devil's Island, where you don't need to put them in jail cells anymore, because if they're so old and decrepit, as poor Papillon has now become, they can't escape, because there's whatever sharks and I don't know how many, 12 miles of sea between there and the nearest mainland. Interestingly, it's at this point, Steve McQueen, Papillon, sees Dustin Hoffman, who plays the character of Degas. Degas was his friend. I think they try to escape together. And Degas sees him and goes like this. And there's this kind of awkward moment when you realize that Degas, as much as he may have liked and had Papillon as his friend before, doesn't want anything to do with him, because he knows, you could say, that Papillon does not abide by the pleasure principle. Papillon is always about going beyond the pleasure principle, because his drive, his insistence is completely unmoderated. His insistence to escape is never going to die. So Degas tries to shuffle off, and then we have this nice kind of comparative thing where Degas is basically saying, "I got a little patch, I feed my pigs, I'm okay here. Look, it's madness. We're never getting out of here. We're never going back to France. This is all there is. Let's just make the best of our humble pleasures that are here." And of course, Papillon's not having any of it. So this leads up to the third key signature scene in the film, at least for me, where Papillon hatches a completely crazy plan. He collects a whole bunch of coconut shells. He sews them together. This is also, just by the way, apparently true. It's based on Henri Charriere's memoir, Papillon, written after he does successfully escape, unbelievably. And we have the scene where Papillon has got this sack full of coconut shells, and he goes to a cliff face. And I don't know how high it is, like 200 feet above the sea. And he spent a whole lot of time watching things come in, trying to get a sense of the tides. And Degas, the Dustin Hoffman character, goes, "You know you're going to die. You know this is mad." And Papillon says, "Oh, I've got to try." And off he plummets. Well, first of all, he throws the sack of coconut shells, then he plummets down and he grabs onto this thing, and he looks like he's going to be dashed against the rocks, but eventually the tide takes him out. And he's lying on the sack of coconut shells, and he says, "You bastards, I'm still here." Okay, maybe slightly overly dramatic. And then right at the end of the film, the closing sequence comes and the writing on the screen goes, Papillon did escape, he outlived the French penal system in Guyana, which is a kind of nice moment because here death drive seems to have persisted even beyond the symbolic, as it were, actual existence of that system. But let's just make one further comment here. The final scene where he's on the coconut shells, you could say, oh, it's our Shawshank Redemption moment. But it's not, because the creature that's left, who's persisted beyond many, many possible deaths, actual deaths, and who's persisted beyond a symbolic death, is both sublime in the terms that Lacan would use in Seminar VII, but also somewhat disturbing. He's moved beyond the parameters where maybe everyday ordinary folk, the likes of me, could easily identify with, because he's done something extreme. He's become the subject of the death drive. And of course, this is the moment of a kind of ethical grandeur. And just to emphasize the point again, this moment of ethical grandeur, and of course I'm kind of basking on some of the terms that Lacan uses in Seminar VII, is somewhat disturbing, because it's difficult to identify with someone who is so willing to follow this pursuit, to take their drive, a pure form of drive which is not going to be moderated by the pleasure principle, by the norms of society, by any ideas of everyday happiness, and to go with it and to be so defined with it that everything, including their own demise, is of secondary importance. And it's in that sense that Papillon does not give way on his desire, to use the terms of Seminar VII, and in that sense becomes something of an ethical figure, because he's willing to risk absolutely everything. And in my terms, that's not just not giving way on his desire, but it's being, as it were, faithful to this insistence of death drive, to escape at all possible costs. Let's just do a little mini conclusion there, just to try and encapsulate things. When Lacan makes this description of Antigone, and hopefully in the next session I can read you a section from it, the idea is that what Antigone does is that Antigone is faithful to, like, things get a little tricky here, because in Seminar VII, Lacan is talking about this in terms of desire, but I think it makes sense in terms of Lacan's later formulations in Seminar XI to also use this parable, this myth, this story as a way of thinking about death drive. And he does that, of course, in Seminar VII. There is a section, Antigone and death drive. But this idea is that Antigone is willing to, she will follow this incessant desire to make sure that her brother is buried. Despite that, it means that she's at odds with the laws of the city. Despite that, it means that she gets locked up, entombed. And in that moment of being entombed, she's dead to the populace. She's now dead. She's no longer ever coming out of that because she's been condemned to death. She's no longer coming out of this. And she willingly holds on to this lethal agenda of burying the brother, a bit like Charriere, the lethal agenda of willing to escape, despite that it will almost certainly end in his death. That moment where she is now moved beyond the point of symbolic death. She's not physically dead, hence the idea of being between the two deaths, which is one nice way of thinking about illustrating some of the themes that we've tried to think about in terms of the Lacanian death drive, because both of those figures are animated by a libidinal insistence. They're impassioned, they're agitated, they've got a jouissance in this objective, and it has taken them beyond the parameters of everyday symbolic life into a place where they risk, where in fact in many intents and purposes, like in some ways, I'm trying to qualify it, in some ways like the social death of the position of the slave, you could argue against that, but they have assumed a position of symbolic death and persist beyond that. Last point to think about. For many of us, that is actually an unthinkable place to be. So let's just make that clear. It's an unthinkable place to be, but there's also an interesting moment somewhere in Fanon's work where he talks about the zone of non-being. And the zone of non-being is a dreadful place. It's you can descend into the hell of this zone of non-being, which is one way that I think Fanon is using terminology to describe the conditions of abject racist objectification, where one is deontologized, denied a position of the human. The reason I mention that is when Fanon uses those phrases, he also does so with a sense that there might be a form of radical political agency that stems from this situation. Hence, my point back to Charriere and Antigone, yes, you've had to persist beyond symbolic death. You are in symbolic death, actually. You've persisted beyond being a symbolic existence. And the point here would be, presumably, that there is the possibility of some radical, dramatic, transformatory process that the death drive enables. We're not trying to glamorize it, we're not trying to romanticize it, but the Papillon who does finally emerge at the end of this crazy, deathly, hopeless task, this death drive fueled adventure, is not Charriere who started. It is someone or something, death drive invested subject, who is fundamentally different.